2013. This is my first crack at hosting a webinar, so I want to thank Paul Stark for all his work in setting this up. Paul's our Policy Engagement Officer at FCA. So thanks very much, Paul. You've seen the acknowledgement of country just on the screen there. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders past, present. Thank you. So just a brief introduction to people that haven't been to one of our FCA webinars. At FCA, we represent more than 8,300 farmer members and have more than 80,000 community supporters. And these people come from rural and regional communities, workers on farms, all the way through to people in the city. So we really haven't got a country-city divide when it comes to climate change and Farmers for Climate Action. We've got people all over Australia supporting farmers and giving assistance to FCA to do what we do. FCA advocate for deep emission reductions this decade to protect farmers and regional and rural communities. So just a brief intro for the Zoom. We're using webinar mode, so we won't be able to hear or see you, but please put any comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A functions. We've already had a lot of questions come in, so we appreciate that, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. So to get underway, we are joined today by Sue McCluskey, who is the Special Representative for Australian Agriculture. Sue has a wealth of knowledge about Australian agriculture and is a beef farmer near Yass in New South Wales. Sue is a Director of Australia Unity Limited, Live Corp, the Australasian Pork Research Institute and AWN Rural, and also a Commissioner for International Agricultural Research. She is previously the CEO of the Regional Australia Institute and the Council of Rural Research and Development Corporations and Executive Director of the Office of Best Practice Regulation. Sue has held many positions in the National Farmers Federation. Her experience includes strong leadership, strategic thinking and financial management, governance, policy, advocacy and analytical skills. Sue was named the Westpac Australian Financial Review Regional Woman of Influence in 2013 and received the Woman in Agribusiness Award in 2014 for outstanding contribution to policy development. So with that, we look forward to hearing from her insights into the Australian agricultural sustainability credentials and what that means for us as an industry. So thanks very much for appearing for us, Sue. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Brett. Thank you for that warm welcome. I should check bios really and make sure we keep them short. Look, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to go through a number of things around my role, just what I'm hearing and seeing in countries that I visit, but also domestically. And of course, make sure we've got plenty of time for questions because that's always the best bit of any webinar. And thanks to Paul for running the slides for me. So thanks, Paul. We'll go to that first slide. So I thought I'd give people just a bit of background around my role, just in case people are wondering what is the Special Representative for Australian Agriculture. And look, a lot of the time I say it's sort of like a trade ambassador or trade envoy for agriculture. Perhaps depending on which country I'm in, it might be more focused on that sort of ambassadorial role. Other times I get deep into some quite complex policy issues. It is a unique role, and the reason it's unique is that I am a ministerial appointment, but I'm actually an industry voice. So I am a farmer myself. I do have a number of roles, both in the ag sector and outside of it. And I've had a long background in agricultural policy and practice. So I bring all of that, but I very much bring an industry voice to my engagement. And I like to think of myself as being really the bridge between industry and government. So I share what I'm hearing from both sides and then actually can share the sort of messages that perhaps need to be given. When I started the role, it was very much about building engagement with the multilateral system and I guess what we call as good relationships with like-minded country officials. But more and more as we've got into the role, it's been very much focused on sustainability and Australia's leadership in this area that we can actually bring to the fore. Thanks, Paul. So some of the things that I'm seeing, and this has been quite interesting, just in the 3 years that I've been in the role, don't need to tell everyone that, of course, we've had the 3 Cs, COVID, conflict, and climate, that have really put a lot of pressure on all of this, particularly around agriculture, supply chains. And then, of course, we've got the 4th C that we're seeing very much the fore now, and that's cost of living. And that's put a real pressure squeeze on food prices, fertilizers, fuel, and other inputs. Of course, when it comes to climate, we've been seeing what's been happening around the world. We've had the Paris Agreement. We're only a couple of weeks out from COP 29 now. And of course, we're seeing what happens when we do get the main challenges that we're getting to those supply chains, and what that means in terms of climate and just being able to undertake agricultural practices, particularly in the production of food. At the same time, what I'm seeing, and particularly when I'm in areas such as Europe, is globalization is being superseded by protectionism. So where we support free and open markets, what we're seeing is a lot of countries going back to protecting their own. We're seeing very much a process-based approach to the global standards, once again, coming very much from Europe, and less about outcomes. And so we're seeing a lot of prescription, a lot of regulation, and I'm sure many of you would have seen the agitation that Europe has seen in recent times from farmers in particular about the amount of regulation that's really becoming quite a heavy burden for them. Thanks, Paul. But at the same time, of course, we know that we're going to have an increase in world demand for food and food security. And of course, that increasing world demand is going to impact on trade and just the challenges about meeting food security. Our growing markets are really going to be close to us. So that's in Southeast Asia, and they are really going to be quite huge, particularly when we look at China, India, but Vietnam and other countries like that are going to have a huge demand for food, and we are actually well placed in terms of being able to supply this. Thanks, Paul. But the challenges that I see, and this particularly comes to me from when I am in overseas countries, is that we've traded on our reputation as being clean and green for a long time, but that's starting to be eroded. And, we've seen part of that come through challenges in developing our free trade agreements, such as with the UK. But we've also got other countries that have seen this as being an opportunity, particularly when we think about sustainability. We know that New Zealand, of course, as a close neighbour, has always traded on their clean and green image. But, countries such as Ireland, for example, are really seeing this as an opportunity for them to actually get opportunities around trade and market access. And the UK is also trying to think about how they can demonstrate sustainability. Social license to operate is really becoming a key driver in the EU. They have the most amazingly powerful NGOs, which has actually driven EU legislation around what they call their farm to fork. And, I continue to be taken aback whenever I'm in Europe at just how the power of the NGOs can really drive this. And we just end up being not so outcome focused. So it can be ideology, and we've just got to be really careful about this. And think about what are the outcomes we really want to see. And, why are we concerned about the EU? It's because the amount of influence they do have on global rules and standards, and also the influence that they will have on our closer markets, such as in Southeast Asia. And of course, that flows through to the impact on domestic policy. So it's not just in relation to exporting, it really does flow right the way through. And of course, the other thing that I'm seeing very particularly is that we need to demonstrate what we're saying around sustainability, and that's where it comes down to credentials, and that's going to be coming more and more to the fore. Thanks, Paul. So one of the things I always say, and this comes back to what I see coming from Europe and the power they really have to influence our global rules and standards, is that there's no one size fits all. And we've really got to think about being outcomes focused and not prescriptive. You know, the way I farm at Yass, and I'm a cattle farmer, is quite different to the way that Brett would farm down in Tasmania, and different to even, you know, the way some of my neighbours would farm. And that's because we actually have different production systems, different climatic conditions. We have different business enterprises. And so we've actually got to think about what is fit for purpose, and that there is no one size fits all. So I very much, when I'm in country, advocate for place-based solutions that really then embrace the diversity of our different environments and production systems. And the other challenge that we have, of course, as Australian farmers, is that we're not subsidised. And many countries in the world subsidise their farmers. So another discussion I have when I'm in countries is there a way to repurpose sustainability support for better sustainability outcomes? And this is something that I very much was able to discuss when I was in the UK very recently. The other pressure point we're getting, of course, is if we're going to actually demonstrate our claims to sustainability, we've got to be thinking about data points. How do we measure and how do we report? And particularly when we've got so much diversity in the system, how do we get comparability? Thanks, Paul. So far this year, I actually spent the first half of this year very much focused on domestic engagement. It's very important for me. If I'm going to go and be the voice of Australian agriculture, I can't pretend to be able to represent every one of you, but I try to get around as much as possible, learn from what I'm seeing and hearing, so that I can actually include that in what I'm advocating for overseas. And of course, there's nothing more powerful than real live examples. So the first half of this year was a lot of engagement with peak bodies, with NGOs, RDCs, very much trying to learn about what are the different tools and measurement processes that are in place. How can we build on that? I've been actually really pleased about the engagement that I've had with the supply chain and the corporates in the supply chain. When I was first talking to them, you know, a couple of years ago, it was very much about commercial in confidence. We're doing this for our own clients. We're not going to share. I think what I'm seeing now is much more the corporates in the supply chain actually acknowledging that this is a shared responsibility when it comes to climate and sustainability, and they do need to lean in. And so we're seeing much more engagement with not just the agribusiness corporates, but those in the property sector, accounting and law, and the banks. And of course, a number of those are advisors or intermediaries when it comes to farmers, and can quite often be those that farmers will actually turn to in terms of getting information and advice. And then, of course, the corporates are putting pressure on farmers when it comes to data and reporting, and I'll come back to that. I've also had the opportunity to look at a lot of the research that's being undertaken, particularly with the universities. I, had the chance to go to UNE, have a look at what other universities have been doing with their research, look at it in the actual research environment, and then think about how that translates in practice. I do get engaged regularly with the RDCs, and I'm actually on the CSIRO's Food and Agriculture Advisory Group. So that also gives me an insight into what CSIRO is doing. And then from a government perspective, we've had a lot of consultation around the ag and land sector plan. Once again, I'll come back to that. And then, of course, I think a number of you might have been at the Climate Summit at Toowoomba, which for me was actually a really good way of demonstrating co-design, but not just co-design between government and industry. It was also co-design at the government level, where it brought together the different portfolios. And as many of you would be aware, that the agriculture portfolio as a department sits separately, but we need to engage very closely with the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. And so it's very important when it comes to climate and sustainability that we can actually work together. So that summit was actually quite important, I think, in sending that message. Thanks, Paul. In terms of my international engagement, I've sort of been quite focused on this over the last few months. I was in Europe in June, where I actually spoke at a conference in Frankfurt, and then went on to Amsterdam I attended the Green Tech conference there, which was primarily around horticulture, but also had a number of meetings there and went on farm. This was actually a good opportunity for me to actually travel with the National Farmers Federation. One of the things I've been saying for a while is there is only one of me and I am part-time. So how do we actually engage and share the love with others, particularly if they are in country? And this was quite an interesting experience for both Tony Ma, the CEO of the NFF, and myself. We went on farm. We spoke to this young farmer. He was 34 years old, doing paddock to plate, absolutely passionate about farming, wants to continue and is not going to be able to, because one of the policy instruments under the EU's Farm to Fork is, in order of meeting their emissions, their GHG emissions targets, is to reduce their cattle herd by 30 to 50%. So he's not going to be able to farm. What the government is doing is they're buying up land. The actual owner of the farm will probably grow potatoes or something like that. And this guy's saying, well, I'm probably going to have to go to France or somewhere else. So I think that was a real lesson for us in terms of you need to think about what are the consequences, particularly with quite blunt instruments such as that, and that we can look and learn at other places in the world, but we've got to think what is fit for purpose within Australia. I then went to Canada, and I was really interested in Canada around their sustainability measures and their monitoring. I had a particular interest in methane because, of course, if we can actually work on reducing methane emissions, that's going to make a significant difference to our overall GHG emissions between methane and waste, food waste. And so I was interested in what they're doing there. Interestingly enough, there were a few things I hadn't realised. And I went to this farm that actually had probably about a 3,000 head cow-calf herd plus a feedlot. It's very cold in Canada, and what I hadn't realised was for 8 months of the year it's in winter and they can get down to -48. They don't have the same level of emissions as we do, but mostly because, of course, they have a very large oil and gas sector. And so they are more focused, particularly from the farmers' side, on management practices, reducing time to slaughter. They do a lot of feeding because it is so cold, and they shed their cattle for a lot of the time. And I actually think the cold does make a difference as well. So there were lessons we could learn. But once again, it was how do we make that fit for purpose for Australia? I also went to New Zealand just after the Canada trip. And one of the things that struck me in New Zealand was really interesting. When I was there 3 years ago, they were very much gung-ho. They got out hard and fast. They were negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. They knew it was about sustainability credentials and they had to demonstrate that. And they had a program called He Waki Aka Noa that was really focused on carbon and GHG emission and measurements. And they were very proudly telling me that it was important to know your number, because if you can measure, you can manage. Sadly, 3 years later, they've had a change of government. He Waki Aka Noa has been abolished. And they're left with a plethora of calculators and they're saying, what are we supposed to be doing now? I think the lesson for me was, and you know, when I saw this 3 years ago, I came back to Australia and I said, don't go out too hard and fast. Let's take the time to listen and learn. Whatever you do, don't bring in a penalty, which of course New Zealand had the threat of a methane tax if farmers weren't going to be able to comply. But a key lesson from this latest trip was, when it comes to something as important as climate, how do we actually embed processes, measures, and outcomes into frameworks that are not subject to the political cycle? Because that's what we've seen in New Zealand. That's what, when I was in Canada, they were saying could happen next week with a potential change of government in the US and the impacts that will have, particularly around climate and targets. So I think when we're thinking about policy frameworks, we do need to think about how do you get not just sustainability, but sustainability over time that gives certainty, particularly to business. Then in October, I did go to Thailand and Singapore. Look, a lot of this was really about relationship building, although I did speak at a Sustainability Expo and was able to present there. And that's quite important for us to be able to work with, our closer neighbours in Southeast Asia to be able to share what we're doing on sustainability. And then most recently, only in the last few weeks, I was in London, Rome, and Paris. So in London, I was really interested to look at the natural capital work that they were doing. I'd only found out a lot of this quite recently when I was at the Nature Positive Summit and had the opportunity to meet with quite a few people there. And I was asking people who's leading on natural capital around the world. And what came back was the UK has been doing this for quite a while. So I had some fantastic meetings in the UK with a whole range of different private organisations, government bodies, where they are really focused on measurement and data reporting, but also the UK, since Brexit, are transitioning away from their subsidies. So they were really looking at genuinely trying to repurpose their subsidies for better climate outcomes and better sustainability outcomes. So I think there's a lot we can learn from what the UK have been doing. I then went to the World Food Forum in Rome. Once again, I think the Food and Agricultural Organisation, the FAO, is an important organisation for us. It provides a great platform for us to be able to showcase what Australian agriculture is doing. And it was also an opportunity for me to actually meet with some of our wonderful Nuffield scholars who were there and once again participate in a panel with them, but also have the opportunity to say there's a whole lot of different Australian farmers here who are able to share and talk about what we're doing in Australia, but also learn and bring back. And then I went on to Paris, where I had some meetings with the OECD. Once again, this was really interesting because even though they've been looking at sustainability and climate, a lot has been focused on the emissions side and carbon side and not necessarily where I think we're heading, which is around natural capital. And so they were really interested in the meetings I'd had in the UK. And so we'll be looking to share contacts there to make sure that they can follow up and include that in their next lot of research work. Then, of course, in a couple of weeks, I'll be going to COP29 in Azerbaijan. Thanks, Paul. So one of the key messages that I do give in, particularly when I'm in overseas countries, but also here, is that agriculture can and must be part of the solution. And, when I go to other places in the world, when I'm in Rome, when I'm in Paris, they absolutely get it. Sometimes I do despair a bit that we don't always get that close link between agriculture and the solutions around climate and sustainability. And yet we've been doing things so well for so long. So, having some of the oldest soils in the world, having challenges around drought, fire, flood, needing to think about water conservation. We've had the EPBC Act from, I think I was at the National Farmers Federation almost 25 years ago, and I remember when it was introduced. And, yes, it's gone through a number of changes, but the fact that we were talking about it then means that we're actually thinking about biodiversity. We've been doing a lot around waste for a long time. And of course, our traceability system is world leading. Our soil strategy is something that Canada has actually copied because we were the only ones who had a national soil strategy. And our waste policy is also world leading. So I think there's a lot that we have to be proud of. By the same token, there's a lot, of course, that we need to either keep doing or think about how we're going to work this, particularly around the demonstration of credentials. Thanks, Paul. The other thing that I've been really proud of, and look, I talk this up in any country I go to, is the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. This is a framework that was developed between the NFF and the Australian Farm Institute. And for me, is a great articulation of what we're doing in Australia in agricultural sustainability. It talks to ESG, which is the language of the corporates, but it also underpins the SDGs, which is the language globally. And those sustainable development goals are actually really important. When you are overseas, and it doesn't matter if you're in Rome or Paris or Singapore, they talk about the SDGs. Now, for developing countries, a lot of that is focused on SDG 2, which is around zero hunger. But we've got to remember that there's a whole lot of SDGs that we can actually seek to meet through this sustainability framework. And so one of the things that I'm seeing now is that we've had a very much focus on what would be on the left-hand side there of that diagram facing you, around some of the economic resilience around animal welfare, around what we're doing on farm. But we're actually moving more now to more natural capital and things like that around soil, air quality, land preservation, things like that. So for me, this is just a great articulation of what we're doing at the highest level. But of course, then we drop down to the detail. Thanks, Paul. So what sits under the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Frameworks are, of course, multiple industry frameworks. And those really are frameworks that are fit for purpose for that particular industry. And they don't all have to be the same because they speak to the diversity. And for me, this is how in Australia we embrace the diversity of our agricultural sector, that we can have individual frameworks that really focus on what are the priorities for that particular industry, but they can cascade up to that overall sustainability framework. Thanks, Paul. So some of the other things that are happening, of course, is the climate change national statement and what we're doing around the agriculture and land sector plan. This is part of our commitment to net zero by 2050, underpinning the Paris Agreement. There are 6 sectoral plans, of which agriculture is one of them. But agriculture goes across all of them. And I had an interesting conversation with Treasury where I said, this is why agriculture must be front and centre and must be part of the solution. And, the initial conversations with Treasury around, but, it's all about energy. That's where the low-hanging fruit is. And I said, and energy is really important for agriculture. And I had a recent conversation where they said, you know what, we're doing scenarios in agriculture, features in all of those scenarios. And when you look at it, electricity, energy more broadly, transport, waste, land use change and forestry, of course, that all cuts across agriculture. So that's where a lot of the consultation is now. And I have to say the co-design process around that has been really great. And I've had the opportunity to be involved in a number of workshops around that. Thanks, Paul. But, it's a really complex space. And, a couple of years ago, I was saying, this is so messy. How do I actually articulate this in a way that is in plain English? Because, of course, we've got a number of other drivers, and one of the drivers is climate-related financial disclosures. So this is the corporate disclosures that our corporates need to make, and it's not just in Australia, it is global. And this includes sustainability reporting. It is being introduced gradually. It does come into effect on 1 January next year, but I did until yesterday sit on an ASX listed board, and we've already done it for last year's financial reporting and as part of the annual report that we put out for the last financial year. That's where we've reported our scope 1, and we're looking at work we're doing around scope 2. So that is the emissions that you generate yourself. But the reality is that the emissions that are generated through the supply chain are also going to need to be reported. And that's what we call scope 3. And for anyone in the agribusiness supply chain, but even broader than that, scope 3 will mean farmers. So even the banks are interested in how they can get data and information from farmers in relation to reporting on scope 3. And then, of course, sitting within that, we have our carbon credit system, which is our market mechanism to be able to look at carbon, measure carbon, and be able to pay for carbon that's stored. And then we start to get into discussions around insetting and offsetting, and I'm certainly seeing a lot more discussion around insetting. So farmers having the ability to use those carbon credits in the future to offset against, say, methane emissions from their livestock. At the same time, we've also got the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So this is where a lot of my focus has been very recently. So trying to actually say this isn't just isolated to GHG emissions and carbon, but we've actually got nature-related financial disclosures that will be coming. I'm seeing a real global collaboration around this, and particularly because it's driven by the financial sector, because it sits around financial reporting. And of course, we've got the Nature Repair Act that has now come into effect, and that will then give way to a new market mechanism, which is around biodiversity credits. So there's a lot of discussion now being had around that. But of course, discussion also around data and measurements, because trying to measure biodiversity is nowhere near. Well, it's not easy to measure carbon and emissions, but it's a lot harder to measure biodiversity. So we're going to have to think about how we actually do that really carefully. Thanks, Paul. So some of the work that's been done in Australia, and once, I was really interested when I was in the UK, when it comes to the work we're doing around natural capital accounting, Australia is actually world leading. There are things we can learn from the UK, but I think putting those two together, I see a really good partnership between the UK and Australia around some of the work around natural capital. AgForce has actually launched their Ag Care tool. There is an independent study being done of a number of natural capital measurement tools around the world, and Ag Care looks like it's going to come up pretty well. So I think that augurs well for us in Australia around where we're heading. But I think we've really got to be mindful about how we articulate that message, because I'm always concerned about the compliance burden on farmers and what this means for them. So we've got to think about the right tranching and how we actually make it easier for them. Thanks, Paul. So I think the focus now is, yes, we've got to do more work in sustainability, and that's both at the strategic level, but also around those measurements and tools, how we make it easier for farmers, how we make it accessible for farmers, how we make it cheap for farmers, how we show them the value proposition of doing this, how we start to think about the natural capital measurements and reporting that will be coming into place. Really important that we think about capacity building and who is best placed to deliver the tools, the information, the education around that. The co-design for ag and land sector will continue. The government has certainly said they're not going to be putting in regulation until there's actually been a really good consultation process around that. And then I think two of the things that come to the fore for me, particularly, from my most recent visit to Europe, is we've still got to tell our story better. And quite often we speak to the converted. So every time I get asked to speak at a conference or a webinar, I'm talking to people who get how important agriculture is. We've got to get that message out mainstream. We've got to engage better with consumers. We've got to make sure that consumers, that kids, that, the whole community gets they need to eat, but where does their food come from? It comes from farmers, and agriculture is essential to that. So thank you for that. I will finish there, and let's go to questions. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Sue. Great presentation. There's a lot for us to digest there, and no doubt some more questions will come through in the Q&A function. But we've got some that were already sent to FCA. So I'll just start through those now. They're wide-ranging, a lot of export questions and market access and things like that, tariffs, that sort of thing. We'll start off with an export question. How does this information affect me if I don't export my products?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And the thing is, when I look at trade and market access, and it was interesting looking at it from my perspective as well, because I'm a domestic producer. When we export and we look at trade and market access, the ability to trade with other countries has a flow-on impact for our domestic production. So in its simplest form, if we get locked out of a market, and, we've seen that happen quite recently in a number of different industry sectors, we get an excess of supply in Australia. So let me pick up on cattle, given that that's the industry I'm in. When we had the shutdown of live exports to Indo, when we had FMD and lumpy skin, when it was lumpy skin, we had a whole lot of cattle not being able to be sold overseas. So those cattle were actually coming into our market here domestically, and they were moving down into southern markets where normally they wouldn't necessarily be. That puts a straight squeeze on prices here, impacts directly on the price that we can get here, also impacts on the availability that we get. There's longer times in abattoirs, longer times in being able to book in for sale yards, and premiums start to be removed because it really is about oversupply and not having demand there. So the impact is pretty quick in terms of exporter market access when it comes to our domestic supply. And then we start to look at the rules that are made when it comes to global standards. So a lot of the rules and regulations that are made in terms of trade and market access and export are really around countries saying, am I gonna want to trade with you in the first place? And if I am going to want to trade with you, is it going to be something that is not going to have an adverse impact on my own sector in my own country? But also, if I'm going to be letting your produce come in, is it safe? Does it meet our standards? And so we can quite often get what we call non-tariff barriers put in. So there will be barriers that are standards that can mean that we're locked out of being able to export because we don't actually have that same standard in Australia. So what ends up happening is, when it comes to countries negotiating around this, does the exporting country then have to impose higher standards on its own producers to be able to export to that country to get the market access, or do they give up that market access? And so if they are going to change those standards, you quite often have those standards that don't just apply to export, but they apply right the way through to domestic produce as well. And, you know, so if I think of ESI, so export slaughter intervals, I don't export, but I've always got to be thinking about ESI when it comes to drench, when it comes to vaccinating, because I've got to do a declaration on that when I want to sell my stock, even though I'm selling straight into the domestic market, or even though I may be selling for dog meat. So all of these are implications that impact on domestic producers and impact on our back pocket, which is very, very important. So that's really why we need to be thinking about the framework of export and market access for us.
Thanks, Sue. Got a big picture one for you now. Where do you see Australian agriculture in 5 years?
So Australian agriculture in 5 years could be world leaders if we take the opportunity. From what I have been seeing, we are doing such fantastic things here that we can really demonstrate and show the rest of the world how good we are at, particularly around some of those sustainability measures, around the biodiversity measures, around our practices. But we've actually got to be thinking about how we get the data to prove it, how we measure it, and how we actually all collaborate and make sure we're singing from the same hymn sheet. So my ambition would be for Australian agriculture in 5 years to be absolutely world leading and demonstrating to the rest of the world how this can be done, and opening up new markets for us and getting greater access in the markets we have. But to do it, we've really got to do a lot of work to work together. And there is a danger that if we don't do that, we won't be in that position in 5 years' time.
Okay, another export one. How important is it that Australian agriculture aligns its commitments, methods, and the sustainability issues it measures with international frameworks?
Look, this is important, and it goes back to that first question around if you want to trade and if you want market access into countries, there's got to be a consistency and a comparability. Now, we've always got to look at what's fit for purpose, which is, you know, and that no one size fits all that I talked about before. And that's where a lot of negotiations can come. And that's why I actually go quite I'm quite robust when I'm in, particularly in Europe, around giving this message that they can't be prescriptive because the way they farm is completely different to how we farm. They have rules around hedgerows, for example. Now, we don't have hedgerows. So there are things that are quite different that must be acknowledged. I think one of the drivers we're going to see, and this is particularly coming from the finance sector around the climate-related financial disclosures and then the nature-related financial disclosures, will be that the international accounting standards that then translate into Australian accounting standards will actually start to have a lot of the requirements for reporting around that. And I think we're getting a lot more alignment because we're getting a lot more collaboration globally around that. I still think we're going to have challenges with at the commodity level when it comes to meeting some of the standards. But I think we've always got to be careful about what are the costs and benefits if we go off and we want to develop our own standard. If we want to develop our own standard that's going to be acceptable within Australia because it's perfect for us, but it's only going to get us into a handful of other countries, what does that mean in terms of our trade and market access? And what does it mean if we then get locked out of a country, or if another country says they're going to pick up on someone else's standard? And that's where I come back to the EU having a lot of influence here. So we've got to put a lot of effort into influencing the EU so they aren't so prescriptive. But I do think we've got to be careful of just going out on our own. We're a small fish in a big global trading world. And even though we're a big country, we are quite reliant on our export trade, and we've got to think about how we can maintain that and then grow it. So I do think we've got to be careful about not just going off on our own without considering international frameworks.
Thank you. We've got one off the screen here. Is there a recognised and widely accepted method for measuring soil health?
That's a good question. Let me take that on notice. I saw there was a bit of what they were doing in the UK, but you know what? I would go back to what we've been doing here in Australia. I'm happy to take that on notice to give you anything I'm aware of. I'm certainly aware of a lot of work that's been undertaken around soil health. I mean, I do it myself on farm. But my understanding with some of the more recent discussions I've been having around this is it goes to depth. So if we're actually going to look at international comparability, how deep do you need to go? And particularly when we start thinking about natural capital, is what we've been measuring so far around natural health only at the surface level. So can I take that on notice and get back to you, either Brett through you or through Paul, with a response to that?
Yep, that'd be great. We can do that. We'll take another one off the screen. This is from Anthony. In Tasmania, methane from livestock account for about 24% of the state's total emissions. As we electrify transport, that share will increase. What are other countries like the UK doing to reduce emissions from methane?
So it's interesting, you know, I didn't see a lot coming from the UK. The two big ones that are really focused on this is New Zealand and Ireland, and they're doing a lot of work around this, simply because they're very export focused. Most of their export is agriculture, and most of that agriculture is dairy. And so the work that they're doing has really been on feed additives and work like that. What I would point you towards is the work that the Global Methane Hub is doing around this. So, you know, 12 to 18 months ago, I was asking the question, you know, everyone's doing a whole lot of different things. Are we collaborating globally? And certainly that's what's happening under the Global Methane Hub. So when they were established, it was about 3 years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago, they actually did a scan globally to look at where are the gaps in the research around methane and which countries are the most interested in this work in terms of have the biggest impact. And then they've looked at different countries to lead. So Australia's actually leading on genetics and inhibitors. And the genetics work, I saw some of this when I was at UNE at Armidale. I think it's fair to say that the genetics, it's not going to be quick, but it is permanent and cumulative, so has a real opportunity there. We've also got to remember that unlike New Zealand and Ireland, where it's a lot easier to put additives into a dairy herd that's coming in to be fed morning and night. You can actually control the amount that they're getting, and you can measure quite accurately. In our open grazing systems that we have here in Australia, and particularly when you look at the northern cattle industry, it's not going to be easy to do that. So the work that's been done around licks and boluses, once again, are probably not going to be as practical for us in an Australian grazing system. South America is another country, Brazil, Argentina, that are also looking at work around this and that are involved in some of those open grazing measures. It's probably fair to say that there have been some really good early results. And look, you know, I had the opportunity when I was in Tasmania recently to look at what they're doing around Asparagopsis. A lot of that's going into testing now, but then the reality of research is that you may get great results in small pilot testing. When you go into broader testing, you might not quite get the same results. You've got to constantly tweak. You may have to change direction. It is still where a lot of the focus is, given the size of the impact of methane emissions on our broader GHG emissions. And what you were saying in Tasmania is the same as what they see in Canada. But I think the important thing is not to do what they say in Canada, which is we don't really have a problem because it's only a small percentage, but saying actually it does need to be a priority. We do need to focus on this, because if we can actually make a difference to methane emissions, we make a significant difference to GHG emissions overall. And I think just a final comment on that, and this really comes from what I see in my role, there's only so much we can do within our own borders. So it's really important that we continue to engage globally and collaboratively, because we've got to get the global emissions down. So the more we can do to help, particularly some of those developing countries, and share the research that we do, the more that we can actually help to make a difference globally to climate change.
Thanks, Sue. We've only got about 7 minutes left, but we'll try and fit in a few more quick questions. Data question: as a broadacre cropping farmer, building and managing data is a large challenge that is often put to the back of the work list. What is a key sustainability data that should we be collecting as a priority currently?
Look, I feel your pain. And so, look, I think the work's been done around what are those key data points at the moment. Certainly there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of free measurement tools that actually measure your carbon, that can help to measure your emissions. Measuring methane is not easy unless you're in a very controlled set. I was at Henty Field Days recently, and you know, I saw some of what they're doing around a measurement tool that you can actually put in paddock and get your livestock to step in. But in reality, that's very expensive, time consuming. Some of the effort that is being undertaken now is trying to look at what are the data sets that are already being captured. I've been really interested in what traceability team has been doing within government to say, how do we actually build on the NLIS system? Can we capture more information, given we've got electronic tags when they go through abattoirs? Are we able to get more feedback in that way? So how do we actually harness the data that is already being captured at the moment, so that rather than getting farmers to actually have to do the work to collect some of this, can we give farmers back a baseline from publicly available data to say this is your starting point, and anything more that you do is going to be over and above that. So there's a lot of discussion around this at the moment. The compliance burden on farmers is very acutely front of mind, because the reality is it's not just about saying we've got to get the data, we've got to measure, we've got to report. It's if you make it too hard, you're not going to get compliance and you're not going to get accuracy. And then it's not actually going to be a credential that we can say stands up to scrutiny. So there's a lot of work and thinking being done around that at the moment. There are certainly some good tools out there. There's a plethora of tools when it comes around to carbon measurement, and they're just getting better all the time. And the technology around remote sensing and satellite imagery is getting better, as is the ability of AI to be able to provide reports back. So I would hope that technology will be our answer to that. It's just the scramble of time is against us on both fronts.
Okay, thanks. The biodiversity one here. How important will on-farm biodiversity be for market access?
Look, this is an interesting one because I would say this is nascent. When I was in Canada, when I was in New Zealand, even when I was in parts of Europe and asking the question, what you're thinking around natural capital, what you're thinking around biodiversity, it was a bit, oh, no, we're not really thinking about this, which is why I turned to the UK. Look, just the fact that we had the Nature Positive Summit, the number of people around the world that are actually really thinking about this and saying, this is what is, it's not just coming, it is here, but we've actually got to get people thinking about it. I think it will be really important. But for me, it actually puts the whole story into place. So if you think on farm, the things that you do that make absolute sense actually are part of the biodiversity story. Why do we plant shelter belts in our paddocks? Protect our soils from wind and to allow our livestock to get shelter from the sun in our hot summers. At the same time, they then provide protection for insects and birds and other things. So I think we've got to think about the biodiversity story as not being a bad thing. It's actually an opportunity, but we've got to think about what we've got already that is part of that story and then what more we need to do to tell a bigger picture.
Okay, thanks. The circular economy one. Can you explain how greenhouse gas mitigation practices on farm and along value chains can contribute to sustainable and circular economies?
Well, certainly, and there's a great story around waste when it comes to circular economies. So food waste contributes a huge amount, and that's not just food waste on, in horticulture, and a lot of work's been done in horticulture around whole of crop use. So, an example I saw quite recently was the use of, say, broccoli stalks to make chips, things like that. But also the food waste from consumers is a huge contribution because it goes to waste, which contributes to GHG emissions. And I like to tell that story because for me, that also connects us back to the consumer. This is a shared responsibility. Don't just point your finger at agriculture and say, you've contributed to the problem. Now you've got to fix it. It's a shared and joint responsibility. Consumers, you can actually help with this by thinking about what you purchase, what you use, how you dispose of your waste. Everyone doesn't have the opportunity that we do on farm, that you can have chooks, you can have a garden, so you really do have very little food waste. But I think we need to get that front of mind. That all contributes to that circular economy around production, consumption, and waste. So there's probably more I can say about that, but I'm conscious of time. But it's a good news story when it comes to waste and the circular economy and emissions.
Thank you. Given the time, we'll probably take one more, and this is off the screen from Alexandra. Can you talk a bit about expectations and ESG standards in our major markets in China and Asia that they're talking about?
Oh, look, I can't talk specifically about that, but one of the things that I do say, and I'll give a few examples from this, is we might think that China doesn't give a rat's about things like sustainability and animal welfare. Believe me, they will, particularly if they are going to get paid a premium further along the supply chain, and I'll give a straight out example in terms of wool, whether it's mulesed or non-mulesed. So we can't ignore big markets when it comes to sustainability. It's why I do make sure that I go to Southeast Asia and make sure that those countries know what we're doing around sustainability, our commitment to sustainability, because the need to demonstrate any claims to sustainability will become more and more to the fore. And countries like China, we know they can be fickle. We know that markets can be lost overnight, and it can take a lot of work to regain them. And sometimes it can take a long time, and it's very costly on our domestic producers here. So it will definitely be to the fore. There will be some markets that will be slower than others, but I would say every market in the world is thinking about sustainability and what it means in terms of market access.
Great, thank you, Sue. I think given the time, that's probably our last question. You've done a terrific job at answering those questions, but I think we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg of your knowledge, so we could go on for another hour, I reckon, the amount of questions we've had coming in. So you've done a great job there, so thank you for that. We've had a wide group of farmers attending and ag industry people, so it's been good to have them there and attending. Thanks everyone for attending. There'll be a follow-up email with the recording of this session, so please let us know if you've got any further questions or you have any feedback about this webinar. But thank you very much, Sue. Thanks everyone for attending, and once again, thanks for coming along, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.